Hello there. My name is Dr. Edda Fields-Black. I'm an associate professor at Carnegie Mellon University's Department of History, as well as executive producer and librettist for Unburied, Unmourned, Unmarked, Requiem for Rice.
And my name is John Wineglass. I am composer of Unburied, Unmourned, Unmarked, and I am a composer of film and television mainly, but for the last 10 years I've been in the concert hall creating a lot of symphonic works for the last 10 years.
Okay, and we're happy to tell you today a little bit about our project, Unburied, Unmourned, Unmarked, Requiem for Rice, which is the first symphonic work about slavery. As I mentioned, I'm a historian who has spent the last 20 years writing about rice, of all things, and the transnational history of West African rice farmers in pre-colonial West Africa, the transmission of rice technology to the South Carolina and Georgia Lowcountry, and then the enslavement of Blacks on rice plantations in coastal South Carolina and Georgia. In addition to teaching at Carnegie Mellon, I've written and edited books and scholarly articles, as well as collaborated with a number of museums on permanent exhibits about rice, such as the Smithsonian National African American Museum's South Carolina Rice exhibit and the International African American Museum, which is under construction now in Charleston, South Carolina. I'm currently working on a new book, which is really exciting for me. It's the story of Harriet Tubman and the Combahee River Raid. Many people don't know that Harriet Tubman served during the Civil War, and she served as a spy, scout, and pilot, and accompanied 2 regiments of Black troops and their white commanders on a raid up a small river in South Carolina, surrounded by rice plantations. And about 756 people escaped in 6 hours. So I'm writing the history of that raid, and really of the freedom seekers who escaped, what their lives were like before the raid, what happens to them during and after the raid.
My name is John Wineglass. I grew up in Washington, D.C. I started playing music when I was 5 or 6 years old, and I started touring when I was 11 with the DC Youth Orchestra under the direction of Maestro Michael Morgan and Lynn McLean. From there, I went on to college with an undergrad in music composition, and then transcended to New York City, where I did my master's degree studying with Dr. Della Gioio of the Juilliard School. I did from NYU though, and that got me into film and television music, where I garnered 3 Emmy Awards in television music. Working in New York, I did a lot of commercials and daytime TV, and that was where a lot of my work began. And then I kind of ascended now into concert hall music out here in California, where I live now. I teach a course on film scoring at Stanford University, and I taught for 10 years at California State University, Monterey Bay, in music composition, theory, history, a bunch of courses on film music as well. So that is my history, and yeah.
He's forgetting a few things.
I'll have to edit that.
He's forgetting, first of all, the work that he's done for the concert hall in the past 10 years, and this project being one of the latest new works he has composed. And he's forgetting that he's a virtuoso violist who has performed for every president since
Ronald Reagan.
Reagan, thank you.
I'm old.
These things are very important, so I have to remind him of them. You know, when you look at the history of slavery on rice plantations, it's a very painful history. It's a history that, on the one hand, you have West African technology that is the backbone of a commercial rice industry in coastal South Carolina, and that makes South Carolina planters the wealthiest in the US South up until the 1850s. But it comes at a very ghastly cost for enslaved people. So here we're talking about, on those rice plantations, the second highest death rates in the New World, second only to Caribbean sugar plantations. On some of the plantations, particularly along the Savannah River, enslaved children, 90% of enslaved children died before they were 15 years old, and 2/3 of enslaved people died. And this is up until the Civil War. So this is up until the end of this pretty evil institution. And it was all very academic for me. You know, I wrote about it, I taught it, I researched it, I lectured about it, and I'm not saying that I didn't think about it, but it didn't impact me the way that it does now. And I had an experience in 2013 that I would have to say changed everything, and really changed the way I looked at history, the way I look at history. My father's family is from coastal South Carolina. That's where he was born. And his parents migrated to Miami, Florida when he was a young child. Miami is where I was born. And I grew up knowing my South Carolina family and spending time every summer with them. And as I transitioned, finishing my work in West Africa and lecturing about it in South Carolina and getting into my new project in South Carolina, and spending quite a bit of time down there doing the research, I was led by our family patriarch to the cemetery where the Fields family is buried, on a rice plantation by a creek in coastal South Carolina, and really found the cemetery in disrepair is the best way I can describe it. At the time I visited in 2013, we had one of our cousins' graves that was open. It was full of water, and his skull was floating at the top. And you know, it wasn't easy to leave that cemetery. It hasn't been easy for that image to leave my mind, and to just be haunted by the legacy of slavery and the legacy of rice and the legacy of the way that people who were made to live and work on these plantations, the ways they lived and the ways they died. I felt as if I was not doing enough as an academic historian who wrote for my colleagues, specialists in my field, and my students. I felt as if I had a particular responsibility to tell this story and tell it to a broader audience. And over time developed the desire to take history off of the shelf and to put it on stage and to introduce it to new audiences, as well as to take this painful history, a history that is very painful for African Americans and Black people around the diaspora, particularly for those of us who have ancestry in the coastal South Carolina and Georgia area, and for my own family history, right? For my own family members, to take this very painful history and make something beautiful out of it. And because I wanted to make something beautiful out of it, I really thought about and looked for and sort of opened myself to the opportunity to collaborate with artists who are much better at this than I am to transform the painful history into beautiful art.
And the way I came across the project was actually more far-fetched than my colleague here. again, I worked in film and TV music for 20 years, and I was actually on a violin jury in the island of Trinidad, Twin Islands of Trinidad and Tobago. And I had first heard of the Color of Music Festival, Lee Pringle, who's the executive director, from a constituent that was on that panel. And she introduced me to Lee. And so Lee and I started talking, and we talked about one project that didn't really kind of work out. And so he said, well, when something comes up, we'll get together. And so a year later, after that first meeting by phone, he introduced me to Dr. Edda Fields Black and this project. And that, you know, he knew of my roots of South Carolina. My dad was born in Georgetown, South Carolina, and I have roots in South Carolina. And with that consideration, I was considered for this project to begin working. I was coming on the premise of 4 symphonic works. This added the 4th one at a very, in August. So for a premiere that's going to happen in February of 2019. Mm-hmm. So my timeline was very short, and I flew over about 3 or 4 times to South Carolina with a whole different lens on my visits to South Carolina. When I was a kid, we used to visit there for family reunions. Mm-hmm. And now I was going with a different lens and looking how slavery was a part of that culture, and how now I'm going and investigating the rice fields or former rice fields of South Carolina. And we actually even took a trip over to West Africa, where a lot of this originated. So that was my kind of introduction to this world. I got kind of caught up in the roller coaster ride of Dr. Edda Fields' research over the last 20 years. I was a TV film guy, and even in the concert hall world, you know, I never really broached topics that seemed heavy, but this was something that came across my desk that I couldn't refuse to be a part of, because it was basically history knocking on my door, my history, my own personal history knocking on my door. So when I got Dr. Edda's libretto, I was extremely touched by it. So the first vignette starts with the middle passage. And so the first movement that I composed is the middle passage, Uprooted. Basically, it's a tone poem of sorts, describing a slave ship. And you'll hear in the violins, you'll hear in the strings, this wooing of a ship in its hull in the storms of the Atlantic. There are actually about 9 different subsections of that movement, and their titles are, the first title is A Ship to Hell, White Ship's Black Cargo. B, a section that you'll hear the ship as it's sinking and rising in the storms. Typically, the slaves were on the bottom halves of the deck of the ship, chained during these tumultuous times in the sea. And then there's a section in the piece called Clearing and Uprooting and Ditching. And this is where, as my excursions took me from Senegal to the shores of South Carolina, the massive uprooting of the trees that had to be uprooted to make the areas for the rice cultivation. And we're talking about 250,000 acres in South Carolina alone. That was what's the word?
Weird.
That was dug out by forced labor. And then there's this D section where the ship literally gets lost at sea. You'll hear it in the music. I equate this work as a tone poem. Then we have a resilient moment. There's a section rampant on the rice shores. There's majestic chaos being taken and sold. And then at the last section of this first movement is the defiance of not only those times where the defiant spirit of the slave fighting against opposition, but what that defiance is defined as of now, in the Michael Jordans, in the Charles Barkleys, the people who the Black culture that has shaped America, where that defiance has shown itself in the culture and the roots of American culture. They love when we're playing basketball. They love our comedy. They love our music, you know, and these are things that have permeated into American culture today. So the first movement basically is the middle passage, and it kind of goes through all these subsections of bondage.
And I'll say about the music that everyone who hears it will tell you that you feel as if you are in the hull of a slave ship in the first section of the first movement, and you're being tossed back and forth on the waves. You can feel that movement and that anxiety of what's going to happen to you. And that transcendent moment where it feels to me almost as if enslaved people were resigned to what they were made to do. And what they were made to do is to build these rice fields. Over 250,000 acres, to cut down these enormous cypress trees with hand tools, right? And dig out hectare after hectare of earth and create the dikes and the bunds with baskets and planks of wood. And the just enormous cost of that on human lives, that they were determined to do it with dignity and with grace. And so that's actually my favorite moment, that transcendence where it turns from, I don't know, maybe from pain to beauty, but it's still pain, right? Mm-hmm. It's still involuntary. It's still brutal.
Yes.
It's still something that would take many of their lives, but they were resigned to do it with dignity and with grace because they didn't have a choice.
So here's the first movement of Unburied, Unmourned, Unmarked, the middle passage.
So as John mentioned, Requiem for Rice, Unburied, Unmourned, Unmarked, Requiem for Rice is based on a libretto, a text which I wrote. The libretto has about 12 sections, and it's drawn from primary sources. So these are documents that were written during the antebellum period, during the transatlantic slave trade, written by slave traders and explorers on West Africa's coast and of West Africa's rivers, slave traders who actually captained and were crew members on ships that crossed through the Middle Passage, plantation records, the diary, for example, of a plantation mistress, WPA interviews. So in many of these sources, you know, they're certainly created for different reasons. They're created to document what's happening for various audiences. And most of them, all of them, none of them thought of captives, African captives, or enslaved Africans as people, as human, right? So I'm working with this raw material and thinking about it, and these are all sources that I've used in my academic research. But what I do in the libretto is to interpret them through an artistic voice and to really try to use them to speak to the pain of captivity and the pain of enslavement and the pain of forced labor on rice plantations. Each of the sections of the libretto is about a different stage in the coastal South Carolina and Georgia rice growing cycle. So every part of the libretto is about a different stage in growing rice. And the stages are in order of how the agricultural cycle goes. And each stage also harkens back and forth to a period in African American history. And those chronological periods, those historical periods, the historical periods are not in chronological order because the order is based on growing rice. So, for example, the fifth section is about flooding, and flooding is the most deadly time of the year. It took place during the summertime. It took place and in flooding, trunk minders would open the floodgates and bring the water up over the rice as the rice is growing, and they would keep raising the water as the rice grew. So in these pools of stagnant water, mosquito-borne, waterborne illness spread, malaria, cholera, all kinds of stuff, nasty, wicked stuff. And so this is a very deadly time for the enslaved population. It's also the time when white planters and overseers fled the Low Country and spent the summers in their houses in the city, Charleston, Savannah, Beaufort, in the Pine Lands, and or sometimes up in the Northeast, right? So the white people leave and the Black people are left to tend the rice and to really be ravaged by these diseases. So it's during that moment of the libretto where you have this moment of intense mortality on rice plantations that the work goes back through the Middle Passage. And the Middle Passage being the forced transport of Western African captives from West Africa to the New World. So that voyage across the Atlantic is hearkened for during this movement, this fifth movement about flooding.
So the second movement is where the libretto actually presents itself for the first time in the work at this current stage. And I approached it with an interesting thing. I took about 3 or 4 trips to South Carolina, and then we also went to Senegal and Guinea-Bissau, West Africa, and we recorded sounds from the rice fields. So the piece uses a lot of special extended techniques with all the different instruments in the orchestra, and they play along electronic tape piece of those recordings. So recorded sounds of mosquitoes. I had sounds of frogs, different things that would have occurred. The second movement is called Tones of the Rice Fields, Free Labor in the Swamplands of 100-degree heat. So I wanted the orchestra, I wanted the audience to feel like they were literally in this rice field. We go from the Middle Passage, the ship in disarray in the Atlantic Ocean, coming from West Africa, landing into South Carolina, and you're immediately sold into, you're sold into slavery off the shores of West Africa. Now you're coming into the new land, the new world, and ourselves right on the rice fields, immediately into slavery, into bondage. And so you hear these sounds, and on top of that is the libretto, several instances of the libretto that Dr. Edda Fields has written. So without further ado, here is the second movement. And the third movement, I have to set that up as well. The third movement, I moved from the rice fields into a lament for lost souls. And this is basically a lamentation to the millions of lives that were lost in this free labor that built institutions of wealth in the South. And so this is a lament to lost souls, a dirge of sense of music that I wrote as a homage to those who lost their lives during those times. So without further ado, here are the second and third movements of Unmourned, of Unburied, Unmourned, Unmarked, Requiem for Rice.
Purple forked tongues and crooked poisonous fangs of cottonmouth, water moccasins, copperheads, and rattlesnakes lurked in swamps and lowlands wait, threatening to cut us down. Oh, Gambia!
Uprooted from states and stateless societies, from fertile farmlands passed down from our fathers, sacred forests and sacred burial grounds, from cities and weekly markets that drew thousands, clans we were born and our wives married into, age grades with whom we were initiated into adulthood, priests and priestesses whose strength and healing practices kept open channels of communication between the living and the dead, gods and oracles that ordered our lives.
Who says we have no history or culture? Only spirits of the dead, people with no needs. Thousands of years of West African traditions uprooted and broken up like majestic old cypress trees.
I was a big-framed girl, to beating swimming flesh, because the Negro driver wanted me. He gave me a task I couldn't do. When I didn't finish, he sent me to the barn. I hid. He dragged me out, laid me across the barrel, arms spread and feet tied to the floor. Driver gave me 25 to 50 lashes till my blood ran all down the barn floor and cut my
over all the men and women on the place. I set the tasks, stripped and lashed the hands who wouldn't work. I gave permission to the men to visit their wives abroad when work was done. I kept the keys to the storehouse, gave out rations, allowances of cloth and tools. I was trusted with firearms to protect the plantation, hunt deer and ducks for master's table. We always provided well for our people too. I traveled or sent letters reporting to master in the city, Pinelands, and Seacoast. Second in command to the overseer, first in command in the sickly summers when the whites fled the scene. Yet, we were still only slaves and could be licked like a cart horse any time if the overseer or master was not satisfied. Our only wages were coarse food. We too slept on the cold dirt floor. Our wives and children were dressed in filthy rags, barefooted and bareheaded, exposed to the elements and the lash as they were driven to the fields. Any white man could take our wives or daughters, use them up, then throw them away.
Overworked to meet the season, we sank under muck work and poor diet. Lack of stamina and vital energy, pneumonia, pleurisy, chills, fever, stomach worms. Should have buried each child with a small bow and several arrows, a little bag of parched meal, a miniature canoe, and a little stick with an iron nail sharpened and fastened to one end. Should have covered their little bodies with a piece of white muslin, painted the shrouds with figures in blue and red. Our countrymen on the other side would recognize our babies and welcome them among our ancestors.
Oh, Gambia, I will not go again on that big water. That death of our children was the death of our spirits, our will, and our hopes to ever see our homes or our loves again. 10.5 million captives arrived in the New World. Only the most highly valued survived.
Dark, disturbed, deceased ancestors trouble our waters. Trouble the living until we honor our dead. Osset, Yemaya, Mommy Water, take us back to the water, back to the flood so we find our way to the light.
Our ancestors are buried in unmarked graves, facing the creeks on low-country rice plantations, sandwiched between the rice fields and salt marshes.
It is unnatural for the young to forget the old, and for our ancestors to remain unmourned, unburied. Watery graves have no markers. Too many violent, senseless deaths. Too much oppression, disremembered.
Oh, Gambia, no peace, no rest for the ancestors and gods that made us to survive. The violation of capture, the terror of the Middle Passage, the atrocity of enslavement, and the deprivation of reconstruction. Dark, disturbed, deceased ancestors trouble the waters, trouble the living, until we honor our dead.
My ancestors, weeping and wailing, haunts me, beseeching me to tell their story and bury their dead. Osset, Yemaya, Mommy Water, take me back to the water, back through to the floods to find our way to the light. From the unbroken graves, untended and grown up like fallow fields, let the unburied, unmourned, unmarked rise up, dark, deceased ancestors. Rise up
and go to the light.
this project has been a labor of love, and it's been a long-term, multi-year process. With some success, we've accomplished a lot in our time together. First of all, we've completed the first 3 movements of the piece, and those first 3 movements were debuted here in Pittsburgh in February of 2019 at Carnegie Music Hall. And we partnered with WQED, which is Pittsburgh's classical music station, FM station, as well as WQED TV to rebroadcast the audio recording and video of the performances, which are available on their website. We are very grateful to the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation for making the debut of the first 3 movements possible. The February 2019 premiere was presented by the Color of Music Festival Orchestra. And the Color of Music is an orchestra of musical ambassadors and all of the musicians are people of African descent. And it's based in Charleston, South Carolina. So we're very, very grateful, given its proximity to the rice plantations, to the Color of Music for presenting the work in Pittsburgh, and then presented it again in Nashville in November of 2019. And we're also very grateful to the Heinz Endowments, the Pittsburgh Foundation, Carnegie Mellon University, Greater Pittsburgh Arts Council and the Opportunity Fund for commissioning the work, for commissioning the first 3 movements and commissioning the final 3 movements, and making John and I's collaboration possible.
So in making beautiful art from painful history, we had a continuous performance here in San Bernardino with the San Bernardino Symphony under Maestro Anthony Parther, which was sold out performance for that work. And I am in the process of finishing the last 3 movements, which would include choir, so chorus, SATB chorus, solo, mezzo, soprano, solo, baritone. There'll be 2 arias equated to each one of those, and full orchestra. And we have aspirations to actually turn this into a full opera. So this will be the premise. We have basically 3 works here, one of a symphonic work of 3 movements, then a symphonic work of chorus in 6 movements, and then we're looking at some point having discussions of a possible opera, a full-scale opera performance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Over the years, as the chief spokesperson and fundraiser for Unburied, Unmourned, Unmarked, I get a question frequently about why classical music and why a requiem? Why not jazz or hip hop or gospel? Black people don't listen to classical music, so why would you write a requiem? And I always find the question a little bit amusing because, of course, it's not true that Black people don't listen to classical music. That's number one. And often the way I answer is that, people of African descent are really multifaceted, and we can express ourselves through any medium or genre we choose. That's when I'm feeling a little cheeky. But when I actually want to engage the question, then I talk about the Requiem, because this is the Requiem. I was originally attracted to the Requiem as a pre-existing genre that deals with death, that mourns and laments the loss of the souls of the dead, that mourns and laments the repose of the souls of the dead. And I was intrigued by how infrequently the genre has been used to mourn the souls of Black people. Today, historians estimate that 15 million people were forced against their will to board slave ships in West Africa and transported across the Atlantic, and 12.5 million arrived alive in the New World. That's 2.5 million lost. I wanted to mourn those deaths. I wanted to mourn the 90% of children who died before their 15th birthday on rice plantations in South Carolina, and the 2/3 of enslaved people who died up until the Civil War. And I wanted to mourn for my own family members who were enslaved on rice plantations and forgotten after emancipation and as a result of the Great Migration. For all of the people whose graves we haven't tended, some of whose lives we don't remember, I wanted to mourn for them. And I wanted to make this genre, this Requiem, speak to our enslaved ancestors. And on the one hand, there's a Requiem, which is this pre-existing genre. On the other hand, in many West African cultures, you have funerary practices that are specifically for untimely, accidental, and suspicious deaths. One of which is Kasab from the Jola in present-day Senegal. And the Jola are quintessential rice farmers. When we were in Senegal, we got a chance to visit a few Jola villages and to talk with elders about particularly, not only about rice, but about Kasab. As this process of interviewing the corpse via spirit possession after someone dies, someone who is not yet an elder, someone who is still able to work. Anyone who dies, except a woman dying in childbirth, under those circumstances, it was considered suspicious. And it was only after the cause of death, and if anyone was at fault, were determined, and harmony restored between the two families, that the person could be buried. And the way I saw it, we had millions of people who needed this kind of burial and who never got it. And the Requiem was a way to merge these forms and to, on the one hand, with the libretto, to interrogate the dead and to hear their stories, and on the other hand, with the music, to mourn and lament their loss, our loss of them, and to restore harmony and peace. And what I think we hoped was that this would create an opening, that it would create an opportunity create a new genre for oppressed people to tell our stories and to mourn our dead and to celebrate our contributions to the world.
So, future plans for Unburied, Unmourned, and Unmarked are finishing the next three movements of a 6-movement work with chorus. So we have a first draft version of a symphonic work in 3 movements. And then I will be finishing, hopefully by the end of this year, the next 3 movements for a 6-movement work with chorus. We've talked about plans of also extending this into a full-on opera. Hopefully also as an educational tool to schools. When we do concerts, there'll be an educational component with possible literature about these times. We want to turn this into something not just a concert, but an infiltration into a city to expose people to the truth and to things that a lot of people are not aware of in regards to rice cultivation. And so Yeah, that's it.
Okay, thank you. And this is actually stage 1, the 3 movements. Stage 2, 6 movements with chorus. Stage 3 is that we have 2 additional members of our team, one of whom is Julie Dash, the internationally renowned filmmaker director. Julie's best known film is Daughters of the Dust, which won the award for Best Cinematography at Sundance in 1991 and was nominated for the Grand Jury Award. It is the first, it was the first film by an African-American woman to have a major studio release, and it was re-released in theaters in 2017. Julie has had a very prolific career. She currently is a distinguished professor at Spelman College, and she's working on 2 films. One is a major film on Angela Davis for Lionsgate Studio, and the other is a documentary about Berta Mae Grosvenor, who was a pioneer food historian from coastal South Carolina and Georgia. And Julie won an award from the NEH to produce that film. And her cinematographer, David Clayson, and David has done a number of projects, many of which are with Julie, but on his own, the best known of which is Diary of a Mad Black Woman. So he's an amazing photographer and cinematographer. And what Julie is going to do is she's going to shoot film installations, which are going to be shown in performance. And the installations will be of rice fields, of slave cabins, of the coastal low country region, so that the audience has an immersive experience. The audience will truly be transported back to coastal South Carolina and Georgia rice plantations during the antebellum period by hearing John Wineglass's music and, you know, being in the hull of a slave ship, by hearing the sounds of the rice fields and seeing images from the rice fields, as well as hearing the libretto and hearing the stories of the enslaved. And we've been in discussions about, in addition to additional performances of the 3 movement piece and the debut of the 6 movement piece, a debut in which we put it all together, 6 movements, chorus, soloists, and film installations. So those discussions were ongoing before COVID-19, and we're hoping that after the global pandemic, we will resume and finalize them. We traveled with a film crew, TV Kiele from Bissau, Guinea-Bissau, which is headed by Dimba Sanha. And they, in addition to recording authentic sounds from the rice fields in West Africa, they recorded footage that we're going to use to make a documentary. Julie Dash is the documentarian, and the documentary is going to chronicle the journey of the making of this historic work, the first symphonic work about slavery. It will chronicle John, Julie, and I's family connections to rice plantations, and really try to give the viewers another way to experience this history. And the center of it will be the creation of this historic work. So the plan is that when we debut the final finished piece with the 6 movements of music for chorus and soloists with the film installations, that the companion piece, the documentary, will also be screened. to truly provide a package, if you will, to cities and to orchestras for community outreach and education. So we've got our shoulders to the wheel, finishing Unburied, Unmourned, Unmarked. And we hope to come to a city near you one day soon.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.